Leningrad's art circles, beauty hid a sinister secret. What treasures would vanish first? The air in Leningrad in 1977 was soaked with contradictions, of beauty and betrayal, of reverence and greed. Beneath the gray sky, the city pulsed with the quiet hum of creativity, but also with the whispers of crime. Art, once the sacred reflection of a culture's soul, had become a currency in a black market where loyalty was bought and betrayal came cheap. In the polished halls of the State Russian Museum, oil paintings from the likes of Filonov, Malevich, and Repin hung like frozen prayers, unguarded or worse, guarded by the wrong hands. The Soviet Union's obsession with protecting its cultural identity had backfired. By locking down its heritage behind bureaucratic walls and ideological red tape, it birthed an underworld that flourished in silence. Smugglers, forgers, and corrupt officials carved secret passageways through those walls, moving masterpieces across borders like contraband, and in the middle of it all stood Evgenia Gudkina. Gudkina was elegant, respected, deadly. With a doctorate in art history and an iron reputation in the Union of Artists, she wove through Leningrad's elite circles with ease. She hosted lectures on symbolism and surrealism, sipped Georgian wine with gallery curators, and penned critiques in state-approved journals. But in private, she drafted forged provenance papers by candlelight, negotiated prices with smugglers in code, and sent priceless works westward, piece by piece. The smell of varnish and pine followed her everywhere. Varnish from canvases she appraised and altered, pine from the forest estates where illegal trades were conducted far from curious ears. Her network was precise. Couriers transported pieces hidden in diplomatic pouches or disguised as student portfolios. Museum employees, often desperate for cash or disillusioned with the system, sold her access for envelopes of rubles. But her true genius lay in choosing the right art, the kind that wouldn't trigger alarms. Obscure works from avant-garde painters, lost studies, sketches that had value in the West but were invisible in the Soviet inventory systems, and none more so than the work of Pavel Filonov. Filonov was a mystery even in death. A mathematical mind tangled in abstract patterns. His art had been locked away after his passing in 1941. His sister, Evdokia Glebova, had kept over 300 of his pieces hidden in a cramped Leningrad apartment, refusing to sell, convinced her brother's legacy must remain intact. Gudkina saw an opportunity. She approached Glebova not as a thief, but as a savior. She wore soft wool and carried books of poetry, speaking of preservation and public access, of honor and future generations. Glebova, weary and aging, slowly allowed her into the apartment and into the trust that would destroy her. 6 pieces were chosen. Gudkina promised they would be photographed, catalogued, stored for future exhibition. Instead, they were smuggled out of the USSR via Riga and vanished into the private vaults of European collectors. One of them, man and woman, would resurface years later, a ghost on foreign paper. Glebova, shattered by the discovery of the betrayal, donated the rest of the collection to the State Russian Museum. But it was too late. The sanctity had been violated. The seed of theft had been planted, and others were watching. For Gudkina, it was her boldest move and her beginning of the end. By late 1978, whispers had reached the KGB. A Western buyer had mentioned a piece in London that should never have left Soviet soil. Gudkina's name appeared in a classified intercept. Surveillance began quietly. Wiretaps, opened mail, a courier followed to Helsinki. But Gudkina, as always, was cautious. She communicated in subtle symbols, slight marks on shipping logs, colors of envelopes, phrases embedded in public lectures. The bureaucracy she had navigated for years now became a weapon. Every request for records was met with delays. Every audit ended in apparent compliance, but the pressure grew. One night in February 1979, an informant from within the Union of Artists cracked. He told the KGB of a meeting in a dacha outside Leningrad, Gudkina, 2 foreign men, and a rolled canvas. A raid was ordered. By the time agents arrived, the dacha was empty. Only a burnt receipt and a bottle of foreign whiskey remained. The canvas was gone. Gudkina was arrested weeks later on charges unrelated to art theft, tax irregularities, misuse of academic privileges, unregistered foreign contact. It was a political arrest, designed to contain, not expose. The Soviet Union couldn't afford to admit that its cultural sanctuaries had been breached from within. She spent 3 years in a labor colony in Mordovia. No full confession was ever extracted, but her silence was not innocence, it was insurance. After her release, she vanished from public view, rumored to have died in Bulgaria, or perhaps smuggled herself out the same way she moved paintings. But the damage lingered. A quiet panic spread through the Russian museum system. Inventories were rechecked, rooms were locked, trust evaporated. And among curators and collectors alike, a grim question began to circulate. If Filonov's art could disappear once, could it happen again? The scent of pine, once innocent, now reeked of deceit. And the shadows of Soviet smuggling were just beginning to move again. Moscow, 1984. The Kremlin walls loomed like silent judges over the heart of the city, hiding secrets within secrets. Deep beneath the surface, in a sub-basement 3 levels down from the State Archive of the Ministry of Culture, a reinforced room existed without official designation. The vault had no signage, no records in public registries. Inside, under flickering fluorescent lights, lay crates stamped in wax, folders bound in twine, and art so valuable it had been removed from history itself. They called it the Black Vault. Created in the 1950s under the pretext of protecting dangerous art, the vault was a prison for paintings deemed ideologically subversive. Abstract works, religious icons, foreign modernists, and most notably, the confiscated collections of disgraced officials and purged oligarchs. But over time, the vault became something else, a feeding ground for corruption. Only a handful of men had access, party elites, trusted archivists, and intelligence officers who decided what would be seen by the world and what would be buried. One such man was Colonel Viktor Gusev of the KGB's Department for Cultural Surveillance. Gusev was not a brute. He was a reader, a strategist. His office overlooked a courtyard where young cadets marched in formation, and behind his desk sat a single icon, a cracked Orthodox painting from the 17th century. He told visitors it reminded him that faith, like power, should remain hidden. In 1984, Gusev's attention turned to the aftermath of the Gudkina affair. Her arrest had unearthed something he hadn't anticipated, a fragment of a larger conspiracy. Not merely a rogue academic fencing stolen paintings, but an entire web that reached into the ministry, the Union of Artists, and possibly the West. A single word from Gudkina's seized notebook changed everything. Filonov. That name set off alarms. Pavel Filonov was not just an artist, he was a ghost. His radical formalism had been buried by Soviet doctrine, yet Western scholars revered him. The fact that his works were leaving Soviet borders undetected represented a catastrophic breach. Gusev was ordered to investigate. But he saw an opportunity for something greater. He proposed a new directive, Operation Dimka, a covert initiative to reclaim and control Soviet cultural assets abroad. Gusev's plan was simple in theory: identify the stolen art, trace its buyers, and either recover the works or neutralize their value by discrediting their provenance. But behind that was a darker goal: to use the art world as an intelligence battlefield. Western galleries, he argued, were perfect fronts for espionage. Buyers were anonymous. Transactions were fluid. Crates could hide more than paintings. Gusev envisioned agents posing as art dealers, slipping into circles of wealth and power in London, Zurich, and New York. But first, he needed leverage. In April 1985, a Soviet defector in West Berlin provided it. Among his papers was a photograph, grainy but unmistakable, of a Filanov piece titled "Man with Orange Eyes," hanging in a private collection in Geneva. The painting had been listed in a 1953 Soviet catalog marked as "missing during wartime." It was never declared recovered. This wasn't just theft, it was treason. Gusev obtained travel logs, diplomatic rosters, and customs records. A former trade attaché had visited Geneva in 1978. His daughter, now living in Paris, had opened a gallery. Her name, Anya Petrova. Petrova was the pivot. Born in Leningrad, raised among curators and intellectuals, she had left for France in the early 1970s. Her gallery specialized in Soviet-era avant-garde, much of it from anonymous donors. Gusev sent an agent under deep cover to Paris, posing as a collector. Within weeks, he confirmed. Petrova had handled at least 3 pieces linked to Gudkina's operation. Now Gusev played his real game. He leaked a false list of recovered Soviet artworks to Western media, baiting collectors into revealing what they held. He arranged for one to be exposed in a Sotheby's auction catalog, drawing public scrutiny. One by one, private collectors began withdrawing suspicious pieces. Prices dropped. Provenance became suspect. Petrova's gallery lost clients. But Petrova was not just a dealer. She was also a survivor. By 1986, she'd caught wind of the trap. A forged courier approached her with a piece supposedly recovered from Ukraine. She noticed the framing was wrong. The pigment smelled fresh. She disappeared for weeks, then reappeared in Madrid under a new gallery name. Gusev knew she was slipping, but more disturbing was what she left behind. A ledger, half-burned, retrieved from a trash bin near the Seine. In it were initials, dates, and one chilling line. Kuznetsov, Volgograd, Black Vault copy. How did a foreign dealer know about the Black Vault? Gusev's investigation turned inward. Someone inside the system had betrayed them. Someone with access not just to the archives, but to the darkest secrets of Soviet cultural control. The vault had been breached before, but now it might be bleeding. The chase had changed. It was no longer about recovering art. It was about sealing a rupture that threatened to expose more than theft. It threatened to expose the lies the state had painted over its own history. And as Gusev stood once more in the fluorescent-lit corridor beneath Moscow, he realized that even buried art casts shadows. Dark, long, and dangerously alive. Volgograd, winter 1986. Snow drifted like ash along the broken edges of the city's avenues, burying the past in quiet layers. Beneath the surface of this once sacred battleground, another war simmered. One fought not with bullets or tanks, but silence, secrecy, and stolen heritage. On a cold Wednesday morning, a faded black Volga idled outside a crumbling neoclassical building, the regional branch of the State Committee for Culture. Inside, under yellowed light and the buzz of ancient fluorescence, a junior archivist named Danil Kuznetsov stared at a letter he wasn't supposed to have seen. It bore the seal of the Ministry of Internal Affairs and a second mark, less official, more ominous. A red wax symbol used only by internal KGB liaisons. The contents of the letter referenced not just missing artworks, but an unofficial ledger, a secondary record hidden beneath standard inventory, meant only for eyes deep inside what was now being referred to as the shadow circle. Kuznetsov, in his 20s, was ambitious but cautious. He'd grown up under the weight of Soviet structure. Rules were walls, and walls kept you safe. But something about this file, buried beneath requisition orders and shelf indexes, tugged at him. One name was circled in smudged pencil: Filanov. 3 weeks earlier, an anonymous package had arrived at the archive. no return address. Inside, 4 Polaroids of artworks and a list of accession codes. The codes didn't match any known catalog. Kuznetsov had filed the incident as a misdelivery, but secretly copied everything. Now he suspected it was a warning, or worse, an invitation. A door creaked open. Enter Marina Orlova, senior archivist, 30 years his senior, and rumored to have once worked with Soviet security services cataloging war-confiscated treasures. She moved like someone who no longer feared consequences. "You're staring at something," she said, voice flat. "Just old requisitions," Kuznetsov lied, sliding the folder into a drawer. She watched him for a moment too long, then nodded. "Careful with ghosts, Daniil. They linger longer than you think." She left, but her words stayed. Ghosts. The next night, he stayed after hours, the only sound the whirring of a malfunctioning radiator and his own breath. He reopened the file. Inside was a name he'd missed before, Professor Lydia Kravtsova, former director of the Institute for Theoretical Art in Moscow. Purged in 1971 for ideological deviation, there was a note clipped to a declassified memo. Contact terminated. Last known to possess Black Vault duplicate. That night, Kuznetsov made a decision. He would find her. His journey took him north, through snow-laced towns and forgotten train stations, until he arrived in Yaroslavl, a city that felt like it had opted out of time. Kravtsova lived in a crumbling dacha at the forest's edge, surrounded by stray cats and shelves of mold-eaten books. She answered the door herself, eyes sharp, hands steady. "I thought I burned every trail," she said, as if greeting an old friend. Kuznetsov explained the letter, the Polaroids, the code. Her expression remained unreadable, but she invited him in. The stove crackled. The tea was bitter. She pulled a box from beneath a floorboard. Inside, carbon copies of stolen inventories, ciphered ledgers, and a faded photo of a younger Kravtsova standing beside a crate marked BV-49. "BV," she said. "Black Vault. The copies were made in secret. Insurance. If the system eats you, you better have something it wants to keep hidden." She revealed that a group of cultural insiders, calling themselves the Circle, had formed in the 1960s to monitor the misuse of Soviet art, both ideological and criminal. But as the years passed, many turned opportunistic. Some vanished, some prospered, and a few, like her, disappeared into silence. "You're saying there's still a network?" Kuznetsov asked. "Not a network, a legacy, and you're part of it now." Kuznetsov returned to Volgograd with a copy of the ledgers. But by then, the archive had changed. Marina Orlova was gone, transferred without notice. 2 colleagues he barely knew stopped speaking to him. One file cabinet in the basement had been emptied. He felt watched. One night, a voice called him from a payphone. "You've opened something? Close it, or it will close you." No name, no tone, just finality. But he didn't stop. He mailed copies of the ledgers to 3 addresses Kravtsova had provided: journalists, dissidents, even a rumored contact at a Western embassy. Within weeks, rumors swirled. Soviet artworks were being re-examined abroad. Questions were asked in hushed tones about their provenance. The market quivered, and then the killings began. A dissident poet in Tbilisi found dead in his bath, classified as a suicide. A former museum director in Minsk killed in a staged car accident. And in Yaroslavl, Kravtsova's house burned to the ground. No remains were found. Kuznetsov went underground. He moved through small towns, changing names, burning papers. But the ledgers were out. The Circle, whatever remained of it, had been exposed, and with it, the full extent of Soviet art crimes. Yet, even in hiding, Kuznetsov kept a journal. In it, he wrote, "Truth is not kept in museums. It's buried with those who die trying to free it." And still, somewhere, someone was cataloging. Leningrad, 1987. The city moved under a shroud of slush and gray skies. Facades crumbled with silent dignity, statues stood like forgotten gods, and the Neva carried the weight of centuries past. The city was still Soviet, still loyal, but beneath its surface ran cracks filled with contraband, secrets, and silent rebellion. In a narrow tenement near Vostania Square, an ex-KGB operative named Yuri Kalinin lived in semi-obscurity. He kept no phone, no address on his door. He paid rent in cash and spoke to no one but his cat. To his neighbors, he was a ghost. To those in the know, he was the man you found when something needed to vanish. Kalinin had mastered the bureaucratic black arts, creating identities, altering registries, rerouting files. He was a forger, not of paintings, but of people. And now, someone wanted him back in the game. A coded telegram arrived at his usual drop, an antique book hollowed out behind a stall in the Kuznetsny market. Inside, a single name written in cipher ink revealed only by heat, Kuznetsov. Kalinin hadn't heard the name before, but the attached note held weight. Vault breach confirmed. Asset compromised. Secure or neutralize. Moscow authorizes discretion. He sipped his tea and sighed. The tea was bitter. The choice was worse. He began tracking Kuznetsov's last known activities. Train records, postal intercepts, missing pages in municipal logs. He found the journalist in Riga who'd received one of the ledgers, dead of a heart attack at 32. Another contact, a historian in Vilnius, had vanished. Each thread pulled the fabric tighter. Kalinin understood the stakes. The Black Vault wasn't just a room of forbidden art. It was an accounting of sins, of who stole what and who let them. If it unraveled, men in high towers would fall. But there was a catch. Kalinin, long ago, had forged one of the very ledgers now in circulation. He'd done it under orders. In 1974, a senior party official, Komarov, had commissioned Kalinin to destroy and replace certain entries from a Volgograd catalog. The real ledger was sent abroad, exchanged for an antique Fabergé egg and a promise of silence. Kalinin never asked what happened to the art. He only remembered the code name, BV-49. Now it haunted him. He caught Kuznetsov hiding under an alias in a village outside Smolensk. The man was thinner, sleep-deprived, hollow-eyed, but still burning with a naive conviction that truth mattered. Kalinin didn't kill him. Instead, he watched. He saw Kuznetsov feed stray dogs, read to children from banned books, and scribble madly in journals he burned every night. Eventually, Kalinin made contact. Under rain, in a church ruin where statues had lost their faces. "You have something," Kalinin said. "I have nothing left," Kuznetsov replied. "But I remember everything." They sat in silence until Kalinin asked, "What's your end game?" Kuznetsov said, "Truth. Even if I vanish, it'll stay." Kalinin nodded. That night he burned his own archive, photos, files, the last forged IDs he'd ever make. He didn't tell Moscow. Instead, he vanished too. But the story refused to vanish. By the spring of 1988, the whispers turned into murmurs. In Prague, a museum curator held a midnight showing of recovered Soviet art, featuring pieces long thought lost to wartime looting. He vanished the next day, his gallery shuttered and emptied. In Warsaw, a former Soviet economist hanged himself beside a pile of shredded documents and a single photograph of a young soldier standing before a crate marked BV. More sightings followed. In Berlin, a man was arrested for attempting to sell a 19th century oil painting bearing a falsified Soviet export license. Authorities let him go. The painting disappeared into private hands, and then the tapes emerged. Crackling, low-quality audio cassettes mailed to Western radio stations. Each carried fragments of a voice, sometimes male, sometimes female, reciting names, dates, inventory codes. Each ended with the same phrase, spoken in Russian. They cataloged us, now we catalog them. Intelligence services scrambled. Some said the tapes were fake. Others feared something worse, that the ledgers had birthed not just a scandal, but a movement. In Paris, Anya Petrova, the art dealer who had once slipped through Gusev's fingers, reappeared. Older now, sharper. She claimed to be writing a book. Rumors swirled that she possessed photographs of missing works, smuggled correspondences, and even a surviving page of the original BV ledger. But books have titles. Hers didn't. Only a plain black cover and a single word on the spine. Filonov. Petrova denied any political agenda, but one evening, under flickering light in a Montmartre cafe, she told a reporter, "Art doesn't disappear. It waits, like the dead." Back in Russia, Kalinin, or someone using his name, sent a letter to an underground newspaper in Irkutsk. It read, "We buried our truth beneath bureaucracy, steel, and silence. But paper survives, so do names, and memory bleeds." Attached was a photograph, a Soviet ledger, on the top corner, BV-49. The photograph wasn't new. It was dated March 1988. The story was no longer a secret. It was a reckoning. Moscow, 1989. The city wore its winter like a burial shroud. Ice cracked underfoot. Billboards peeled into layers of outdated slogans. The empire was shaking, groaning from its own weight. Reforms had been promised, change whispered. But for the ones who carried secrets, hope was a dangerous game. In a government office near Lubyanka Square, a man named Pavel Morozov lit a cigarette with fingers that hadn't stopped shaking in 2 days. He was a liaison, one of the last trusted intermediaries between the Ministry of Culture and the old security elite. He knew things that no one should, about vaults, about theft, about the names that could never be spoken aloud. He had just received a letter. No stamp, no sender. Inside, a single photograph of a painting, Malevich's lost work, or something that looked too close, and scrawled in red ink, "BV-49 lives." His hands trembled as he reached for the vodka. Not from fear, but memory. Years ago, he'd been at the table when the decision was made to dissolve the circle, to bury the ledger, to silence the archivists and deal-makers. He'd agreed, of course. It had seemed necessary, clean. But now, one by one, the ghosts were crawling back into the light. In the underground world of Moscow's black market art trade, rumors burned hotter than the snow could smother. A faceless seller, codenamed GALO, had surfaced, offering paintings that even the Hermitage had forgotten existed. He didn't meet clients, only sent exact coordinates, changing every time. Buyers paid in gold or silence. GALO's final message arrived on New Year's Eve. A location on the outskirts of Moscow, a disused textile warehouse. Within hours, 4 men were dead, shot execution style, and the warehouse was empty, except for a single crate bearing the initials BV-49 and the words, "Truth is heavier than gold." That night, Western broadcasters received a package, film reels, unmarked, silent. But when played, they showed interviews, grainy, handheld footage of former Soviet officials admitting to falsifying records, displacing artwork, forging deaths. Some faces were blurred, some were not. The footage was damning. The Western press salivated. The Kremlin denied. But in the streets of Kaluga, of Perm, of Krasnodar, small independent galleries began reopening boxes long hidden. Private collections opened their doors anonymously, letting the public glimpse lost masterpieces that bore strange stamps, returned. Anya Petrova disappeared again. Her book was never published, but rumors said it had been smuggled out and translated, circulating in fragments through underground presses, under the code name the Filonov Papers. Kuznetsov, it was said, died in a fire in Vologda, but no remains were confirmed. Others claimed he lived in Finland under another name, or in Argentina, or that he had become GALO himself. Kalinin was never seen again. But the Black Vault could no longer be denied, not by silence, not by steel. In 1991, as the Soviet Union fractured, a final ledger was delivered to the Hermitage Museum. Anonymous, burned around the edges, but legible. It listed over 300 works, stolen, hidden, sold, but now known. And in the final page, one line: "Art does not die, only empires do." But that wasn't the true ending. It never is. In 1992, a curator in Vienna found a second volume, identical formatting, same BV insignia. Inside were names not only of paintings, but people. Code names, dates of disappearance, cryptic references like S-shadow and K-glass. The discovery shook the remaining intelligence community. Who else had been part of the circle? What did these ciphers mean? Some entries were crossed out, others had arrows pointing to Western capitals. Interpol quietly launched an inquiry. MI6 and the CIA denied involvement, but records show surveillance increased on several Russian émigrés. One, a man named Leonid Makarov, vanished in Brussels. Another, an art historian in New York, was found drowned in his apartment's bathtub, though he lived in a walk-up with no plumbing issues. Meanwhile, anonymous exhibitions bloomed across Europe, in abandoned chapels, in subway tunnels, in barns turned into galleries for a single night. Always the same theme: lost Soviet art paired with photographs of the missing, and always the same closing piece, a painting of a faceless man reaching toward a black vault door, signed with a red V. Some called it performance, others called it revenge, but most never spoke about it at all. In Russia, the Filanov name became legend. Not just the painter, but the project, the movement, the reckoning. Teachers whispered it in literature classes. Soldiers etched it on barracks walls. Activists painted it in the shadows of monuments. Filanov was no longer a person. It was an echo. And in 1995, the echo returned to Lubyanka. A plain envelope. No stamp. No return. Inside, one photograph. An elderly man, balding, thin, standing at the edge of a beach in Sakhalin, holding a child's hand. Behind him, half buried in sand, a crate. The initials barely visible, BV. No one claimed responsibility. No one needed to. The reckoning had no author, no central figure, no final confession. Only a truth too vast for one man to carry. Only silence, only memory, only art. Don't scroll past. Hit like and subscribe if you're ready for the next twisted story.